Revolution is a big word. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, so in order to sort of establish a common language here, we're gonna have to actually talk about what we're talking about. Or rather, I will tell you, because this is not a conversation. And though I am going to be using more of a historian's definition of the word revolution, I'm not actually referring to any specific historical revolution. I'm talking about the revolution, the big revolution, where the oppressed masses finally band together to overthrow their tyrants and build a new system based on better values. Most often, this notion of revolution is espoused by leftists who wish to overthrow economic oppression, given that we in the West at least live in at least a moderately right-wing paradigm. It depends on where you live exactly that it gets more or less right-wing. There's also people who think of the revolution as a means of instituting the vegan super eco-state, and not to mention the countless denominations that exist of socialism. Hell, there's even a lot of right-wingers, especially of the libertarian variety, who hold the notion of revolution dear. And there are those who think of the revolution explicitly not as a violent process, but as a slow, gradual change of the systems within society, which is what people who use accurate words to accurately describe things would describe as reform. Most think of revolution as the violent overthrowing of the governing status quo, usually also the governing system itself, and this is generally what historians mean when they use this term. A populist movement overthrows a government using means of violence. Now, of course, this is absurdly idealized and frankly a bit dangerous. A lot of, especially young, middle-class, university-educated would-be revolutionaries do not seem capable of understanding the horror that is revolution. Because it essentially amounts to a civil war, and you could make a case that civil wars are just revolutions that have failed in some contexts. In their minds, a revolution is when the good guys from the masses come together and overthrow the bad guys at the top. Of course, they will acknowledge in some abstract term the necessity for sacrifice in that situation, but it's all for the greater good. They do not seem to understand that revolution means a breakdown of the social contract, of any semblance of rules and order that do exist, even in the most anarchist of societies. They don't understand that revolution means factionalism, infighting, and betrayal. Not to mention rape, murder, and willful destruction of not the property of the capitalist class necessarily, but generally of those people who can least defend themselves. Once you reach a certain tipping point of a breakdown of the social contract, people begin to do just anything that they can get away with doing. And trust me when I say that there's a lot of people who will do a lot of fucked up things if they can get away with it. The people right now and earlier in the year looting in the shadow of the BLM protests in the United States, those are not protesters. Those are people who know they can get away with it. Not to mention that at the end of the revolution, the people who ultimately get to define what replaces the system that has been abolished are not the people with the best or most popular ideas, but the people who control the means of violence. And the point at which you stop doing violence in order to further your political goals is the point at which you surrender the means of violence. This is why, at the end of a revolution, the faction willing and able to do the most violence in order to achieve their political goals ends up being the one in charge. Power obtained by force must generally be defended by force. This is why the overwhelming majority of violent revolutions were followed by something that can in some way be referred to as a reign of terror, including the archetypal revolution, the French Revolution. Now, I'm not discounting violence as a means to achieving positive political change entirely. When used sparsely and with precision, it can actually be a very effective tool. Anyone who is followed Maidan knows this. However, the overwhelming majority of movements that have been able to enact positive systemic change were explicitly pacifist movements, and it is empirically demonstrable that such movements have a much higher rate of success. This is why many of the Black Lives Matter protesters, when they see someone looting or rioting, get very, very angry, because those people are undermining their message and their ability to create positive systemic change. There is an ethical case to be made for instance, you have a munitions factory where they create ammunitions for the war effort that will ultimately end up killing people. And you have the chance to destroy this munitions factory somehow without any people getting injured. You could very well argue that you'd be in the right to do this, and possibly even in the wrong not to do this. Some people would argue that what Sea Shepherd does is akin to violence, yet very few people would complain that what they do is actually a bad thing. However, reality, as it tends to be, is a lot more complicated than that, and of course, legitimizing the tactic of property damage, as inconsequential as it ultimately might be, might inspire other groups that follow a similar creed to your own to do similar acts, except maybe they're a bit more extreme and they think that the night watchman who hangs out in that factory after hours getting paid next to nothing, well, it's his own fault that he serves these evil warmongers. It's not a problem if he dies. This, of course, immediately destroys public goodwill toward what you have been doing. If you're going to use violence in order to create meaningful systemic change, you need to be very, very careful not to surpass the threshold where the social contract breaks down and the most violent faction ultimately ends up being the one with the most and the best cards. And this is an extremely volatile thing that I would explicitly advise against. It is a Pandora's box you probably do not want to open because you cannot control it. What you need to do is make the normies agree with you, and violent revolution is not the way to do that, because normies tend to be opposed to violence. Shocking, I know. Now, it is of course very important to, in this context, understand what Martin Luther King meant when he said that rioting is the language of the unheard. Now, contrary to what some people would have you believe, he was not endorsing violence and property damage at all. In fact, his movement and he himself were explicitly non-violent. He was merely pointing out the fact that if you do get stomped on by the boot every single day and you have no recourse, you have no way of making the people who should hear you, of making them change the situation in some way, of course a lot of people are going to let out their frustrations that way. That is entirely understandable from an emotional standpoint, even if ethically it's very much questionable. A riot is a symptom of a broken system. It is not a tool for political change. The people doing the rioting are also rarely activists. Yet the idea of using violence to create the revolution that ushers in the utopia is one that is especially popular among young people, and the main reason for this is impatience. I had a conversation recently with someone that I value and respect greatly, and they said to me that of course violence is the very last recourse for systemic change, but they had reached that point. It is the only option that they still have. After all, they'd been engaging in activism for a whole year now, and there still hadn't been any widespread systemic change. It is the lack of perspective and the abundance of noble compassion of youth that leads young people to have such little temperance. And yes, I do realize that this is sort of ironic coming from a 25-year-old, but I do believe that maturity is not necessarily correlated with age. as much as we think. You see, the suffering that is caused by whatever boot is the boot that you subscribe to being the root of all evil, and you want to change it, and you want to believe that there is a faster, better way to change it, because all this suffering needs to be alleviated as quickly as possible. And of course, you are also looking for an easy solution to an extremely complicated problem. But by engaging in that violence, you set back the popular appeal of your cause a lot more than you further it, and thus hinder your cause a lot more than you further it, even if you yourself felt very good about doing something, because that is the pure thing that makes violence so attractive. It is emotional. It is a fulfilling release that does not require discipline. It's dangerous, it's exciting, it makes you feel like you're really making a difference, which you are, just in the wrong direction. In reality, all you're doing is destroying, and you are also destroying the movement that you purport to subscribe to. But change takes an inordinate amount of time, unfortunately, which is terrible. Trust me, I desperately wish it were not so, because I see the suffering, the inhumane treatment that people are being subjected to every single day, and I wish I could just make it stop. But reality doesn't work that way, and it's something that we all have to come to terms with. The problem is that young people often don't really see what has been achieved over the past few years and decades, and maybe even centuries, depending on what specifically you are talking about. Because of course not enough has been achieved. This is what leads to the lack of temperance. This is what hurts the movement so much, not just by, of course, destroying public goodwill, but also by siphoning away the time and energy of young, vital activists. They could be out there using actually slow but effective means of enacting systemic change. Now, of course, there are those people who desperately want a breakdown of the social contract, an increase in violence and destruction, because they desperately want a violent revolution. They want more people in poverty, desperation, and depression, and they will oppose anyone who tries to change something about that using peaceful means. Because if the system is improved and oppression is alleviated, the chances of the revolution are lowered and the revolution is postponed. Be wary of these people, for they are not what they proclaim to be. And then, of course, there is the biggest issue with revolution, at least in my opinion. It makes us complacent. People who desire a revolution of some kind also tend to believe that the system that they are a part of is in some manner unethical. They do, of course, like everyone, bear some responsibility in furthering that system simply by virtue of being part of it, but they don't really have a choice in the matter. If you want to live, which isn't a decision that you yourself made, you will have to play the game to some extent. And just isolating yourself completely from society in order to avoid the ethical dilemmas therein will not change that society. So they play the game, they do all of the things that are part of the system, they further the system just like everyone else, and all the while they wait for the revolution, and the revolution never comes. It's a massive collective diffusion of responsibility where everyone is just waiting for that magical point in time where they can stop being unethical and finally change the world for the better. It's a bit like the biblical concept of rapture, where just eventually paradise on earth is gonna happen anyway. So there's not really much of a point in making the world a better place, the system that you exist in now, because it's going to be replaced with a perfect system anyway. And that is the biggest sap on activist power that the revolution comes with. People don't invest any work to change the system because they can postpone all that for the point at which the revolution comes. That is, of course, not how it works. It's just an excuse to do nothing and feel like you are doing something. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, maybe buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, just chill the fuck out for a second. And see you around, cunts.